Hi folks, this is Tristan from Scalar Music. In this video, I'd like to look at a few different ways we can find and create chords using Scalar 3, and in turn create interesting and nice sounding chord progressions. Now there are lots of ways we can go about this in Scalar 3, but I'd just like to highlight a few different ways which I find particularly useful and interesting. So I just have a basic electric piano sound here. It's nice and punchy, but also quite pretty sounding. And right here from the Browse page, we can start to explore a few different chord options. So Scalar 3 includes many pre-made chord sets, organized into different categories and genres. Here in the common progressions category, for example, we have some basic, traditional chord progressions, which we've all heard many times before. This is great for any kind of pop song. But over here in the uncommon progressions, we have some more unusual, sort of less orthodox sounding chord progressions. And there's a few different voicing flavor variations of each of these. I quite like the colored version of this one. Sounds very nice. So we could take a couple of chords from here, but we don't just have to take all of the chords in the same sequence they appear here. We might like to start with the C, and then move to the B flat, or from the C to the A flat. I quite like going from the C to the B flat, so let's take those two chords and use them to start our progression. Okay, that's a nice sounding pair of chords, but we can try adjusting the transposition of these to try to thicken them up. Let's move them down to one semitone lower and see how that sounds. Okay, to me that just sounds a little bit thicker and warmer, so I'll leave it there, starting on a B major. So now that we have a couple of chords selected, the next step might be to choose an appropriate scale. So selecting a scale in Scalar 3 affects quite a few different aspects of its operation. Most notably, it changes the color of all the chords to indicate their relationship to the selected scale. Blue chords, for example, contain only notes from the selected scale, whereas gray chords like this contain no notes from the selected scale. Our current selected scale, which is D sharp or E flat major scale, is related to our initial chord set we selected, and it's not related at all to our customized chord progression we've made. Whenever you select a chord set in Scalar 3, it automatically detects the closest matching scale, which is done here. But we can instead detect the closest matching scale to our custom chords by selecting our chords in the main track here, then right-clicking and clicking Detect. So you can see it's given us quite a long list of matching scales here. All of these scales near the top match all 6 notes of both of our chords, so they're, technically equally all suited to our chord progression. However, if we take a look at our chords, it starts off with a B major chord, moves to an A, and the B major is really where I feel like the center of this chord progression is, so I'd like to anchor this chord set around that B major chord. And looking through the list of detected scales, I see a B mixolydian mode here, so let's have a listen to the notes of that scale. Okay, so that's actually just a major scale, except the 7th note is taken from the minor scale. So B mixolydian mode is really just a B major scale with a minor 7th. That's why we have that A major chord at the end, rather than a B major scale, which would contain a B flat chord at the end. So if we listen to those chords, B major and A major, to me that sounds like a very typical mixolydian chord movement there. And that's almost exactly what we have on our main track here. So I'd say this chord progression so far is very well suited to the mixolydian mode. Now that we have a scale or a mode selected, we can start progressing the rest of our chord set. Now one of the most immediate ways to do this is to use Suggest mode, which we get to by clicking the empty chord with the light bulb in it here. That opens up the Suggest window, which immediately presents a wide selection of suggested chords we could use. And there's 2 different main modes here. There's tonal and per scale. Per scale will only suggest chords within our selected scale. In this case, the B mixolydian mode. And as you can see, all of the suggested chords are blue. This feels like it's jumping around the keyboard quite a bit, so let's turn on Minimize Movement, which will automatically voice all the suggested chords so that they align with our existing chords. Okay, so they all sound like they're in a better position now. However, I'm actually going to move to the tonal mode, which more just subjectively suggests chords based on their tonality without adhering strictly to our selected scale. And we'll get different suggested chords depending on which of our main track chords we have selected. With the B major chord selected, I'm just going to audition a few different suggestions here. Okay, these two chords here are very nice. That's a C sharp minor over a G sharp, and an F sharp major over an A sharp. So I might bring both of those chords down into my main track. Okay, let's have a listen to what we have so far. Okay, sounding very nice. At this point, it's tempting to sort of move to a very conclusive and resolving chord, like a major chord, from this F sharp to maybe this B major. However, that does feel very conclusive, maybe a little too conclusive at this point in the song. It might make more sense at this point to move to a less conclusive minor chord of some kind. So there's a few different nice minor chord options within this B Mixolydian mode's diatonic chords. So we've got a few options to choose from. But I'm going to take a slightly different strategy and move over to the modulation page and select the circle of fifths. So I find the circle of fifths very useful in finding chords which work well with other chords. I'd like to find a nice chord to move to from this F sharp major chord here. So first of all, let's find F sharp major on the circle of fifths. Here it is on the outside. However, here F sharp represents the F sharp major scale. So we have major scales around the outside and minor scales around the inside. And basically, the closer proximity any two scales are, the more notes they share in common. So we have F sharp and E flat minor here. These are relative major and minor scales, so they share exactly the same notes. So I can try out a few different chord movements from this F sharp major chord and just see what I like the sound of. Okay, I think in this context, I like the sound of the F sharp to the G sharp minor. That sounds like a good movement. So let's grab the G sharp minor chord from the right here. Okay, that feels like a pretty good chord move there from the F sharp to the G sharp. However, this G sharp minor triad chord is obviously voiced very differently from all the previous chords, so it sounds a bit out of place. And we can see very clearly why that is if we move over to the arrangement page. I'm just going to highlight all of that chords and select the MIDI editor. And we can see that we have at the beginning 4 very nice thick full chords, and at the end, a basic triad chord, which looks like it's lacking quite significantly in the lower end department. So let's see if we can thicken up this G sharp minor chord somehow. I'm just going to select just the G sharp minor chord. And there's a few things we could do here. I could just grab the pencil tool, for example, and just draw some extra notes at the bottom to fill out the chord a little bit more. However, that's not always the most intuitive thing to do. So a simpler option is actually just to use the modifiers in the sidebar on the left. For example, the density control. Let's just increase the density parameter by 1. And that adds 1 extra note beneath our triad notes. The note here is D sharp, which is the 5th of this scale. So it's really just added a 5th underneath the existing chord. And that's actually transformed it into an inversion chord. So now we have a G sharp minor over a D sharp chord. Definitely sounds a bit fuller, however that inverted chord isn't really what I'm after here. So let's try increasing the density by 1 more step. Okay, that's added 1 more note underneath that 5th note, and that is just another G sharp, so it's another root note, 1 octave beneath the previous root note. Okay, so that gives us a nice thick full sounding chord, very much in line with our previous chords. So, that worked out pretty well, however it does feel like a bit of an arbitrary approach. A more strategic approach might be to actually extract the voicing from one of our previous chords and apply that to our new chord. So I'm just going to undo those changes I made there by taking the density parameter back to 0. And let's find one of our existing chords that I like the sound of. Okay, this F sharp over A sharp sounds quite nice. So I'm going to right click on this chord and choose extract voicing. Then move over to my G sharp minor chord on the end, which is again just a basic triad. And over in the modifier sidebar, there is a voicing parameter. So So let's open up that menu, and I'm going to choose the extracted option at the bottom, which is the voicing we just extracted from that previous chord. Okay, so that's done a little bit more than what the density parameter did before. Density just added a note underneath our existing notes. This has added notes beneath and above our existing notes. So it's transformed the whole chord to sound quite a bit more like the previous chord. Now that sounds quite nice, however this inverted chord is turned into, a G sharp minor over a B, isn't really the sound I'm after here. I'm after more of a conclusive sounding, non-inverted chord. So perhaps we'll extract the voicing from another chord, like this very first chord. Okay, I'm going to right click on this guy and choose extract voicing, then move back over to the G sharp minor, and back in the voicing menu, let's again choose the extracted option. However, this time it's pasted the new voicing from our first chord rather than this F sharp chord. That's sounding pretty good. That's sounding like a nice thick chord. Maybe even a little too thick though. So I'm just going to grab the eraser tool and take out one of the notes at the bottom here. Cool. Okay, that's sounding nice now. In fact, this is basically the same chord we had previously when we used the density parameter. So this whole extract and apply voicing option is really just perhaps a more strategic way to get to the same result. Okay, let's listen to our chord progression so far to see where we're up to. Okay, I think we're in a pretty good position to move forward. So at this point, I could move back to the browse page and just explore this scales diatonic chords a little bit further to find some new chords, but I'm actually going to go back to the modulation page, and this time move to the explore page. So the explore page gives us quite a few different collections of chords organized by genre and mood. So here, for example, we have the ambient genre and the bright mood chord collection selected. And there's some very nice pretty sounding chords here. However, they're really not that well suited to my existing chord set. All of the chord presets on the Explore page are written in a particular key, and that's usually indicated by this lower middle chord here. And as you can see, this is an A flat major chord, so this chord collection is really in the key of A flat major, whereas my chord progression is in the key of B mixolydian, which is more similar to B major. So what we can do is click this little lock icon on the right, and this immediately transposes all of the chords on the Explore page into our selected scale. However, you may have noticed the color of these chords still indicates they're not compatible with our selected scale. That's because the Explore page has this dynamic scale system, which detects the closest matching scale to the last played chord, and then adjusts the color of all the other chords to match their relationship to that dynamic scale. So as you can see, whatever chord I click on, the closest matching scale to that chord is displayed here in the left-hand side, so all the colors we're seeing represent the relationship to this scale, not this scale. If you'd like, you can turn that off, in which case the colors are always based on our selected scale at the top here, but I'm going to leave it on because I do find it very useful. And now that we have our chords transposed into B major, I'm just going to audition a few chords and try to find some ones that I like, which could complement our existing chords. I think these two at the top here sound quite nice. That's a C sharp minor over an E and an A major. So let's try adding those to the end of our chord progression. And let's listen to where we're up to so far. So that all sounds good, and I feel like now we're ready for a nice, conclusive, resolving sounding major chord at the end. So to find one of these chords, I'm going to head back to the browse page and see what I can find within our current scale's diatonic chords. Okay, I think the E major is the vibe I'm going for here. However, at the moment we're only hearing basic triad chords, so they sound a bit out of place compared to our existing chords. In this case, I'm going to open the colors menu by clicking on the word triads on the right here. That's our current selected voicing. And let's select a different voicing to audition. As you can hear, the voicing 1 option has thickened up our chords quite a bit. We can try some different ones if we'd like. Yeah, that's a little brighter. I'm just going to go back to the previous voicing. And that sounds good. Let's take that E major chord and just add it to the end. Okay, I think overall that leaves us with a pretty nice sounding chord progression. So let's quickly recap some of the steps we've taken to get here. We started off on the browse page and just picked some chords from one of the chord sets, adjusted the transposition, and dragged a few down to our main track. We selected these chords, right-clicked, and clicked on Detect, and then we found a nice matching scale, in this case the B Mixolydian mode. After that, we used the Suggest window to find some nice complementary sounding chords. Then we used the so-called fifth page to find out where we could move to from our last chord, which was F sharp major, and we chose to move to G sharp minor. We then moved to the arrange page and played around with some of the different chord voicings by adding notes using the density modifier, and we ultimately ended up extracting the voicing from some previous chords and then applying them from that chord's voicing option. Then we moved over to the explore page and found some nice sounding chords to, again, complement our progression with. And then we finished things off by moving back to the browse page and finding a nice voicing option and grabbed a major chord from this selected scale's diatonic chords, in this case E major. And now here's what this chord progression sounds like with a few extra tracks added, as well as a couple of drum loops from Ableton Live.